back in 2007, we were organizing the prologue, and I was asked to have some input in the prologue or the orientation for our incoming students on what their context would be. And so I decided that I had them read Elijah Anderson's Code of the Street, in which he is an anthropologist. He did a study of Germantown Avenue, walking. One of his chapters in Code of the Street is a walk down Germantown Avenue, and he observes all kinds of interesting social codes going on, but he hardly mentions the many houses of faith. So I grabbed a friend of mine who was a photographer, Ed Conboy, and I said, Ed, let's put together a slideshow for our incoming students. I want them to see the context in which they'll be studying theology, because my theological and sociological understanding is that place matters in education. It matters that our students are studying on Germantown Avenue in Mount Airy and not in Iowa or North Carolina or Ohio. So I wanted to help them appreciate the context. So Ed and I went up and down the street, this was in 2007, and started taking pictures of the avenue, which is 8.5 miles long. It's an historic street. Started off as the great way of the Lenape Indians, who had a trail here that became Germantown Avenue. So we were taking pictures, and I realized in taking the photos and then putting them together in a slideshow and presenting them to the students, what an amazingly interesting and complex social context we're in, Germantown Avenue. So that's how I started, and I took that slideshow, and by then I was hooked. And I started doing some more research and began presenting this to such diverse audiences as the American Sociological Association and the local congregations of Northwest Philadelphia. So a whole diversity of audiences, and people really connected with it. So then I formalized that and decided to go further, and ended up doing a 6-year study of the Avenue, and it's published as a book by Oxford Press, Faith on the Avenue. In doing the study, I found that in 8.5 miles, the census of congregations fluctuated. At any one time, there were between 83 and 95 congregations on the Avenue. Huge diversity. We have 11 mainline Protestant churches, like this one, St. Michael's Lutheran Church, which is very historic. We have on the Avenue 3 mother churches, the founding congregations of the Brethren, the Mennonites, and the Salvation Army in America, where Eliza Shirley, as a precocious 16-year-old, started the Salvation Army further down the Avenue. We have 3 mega churches, largely African-American mega churches, which are very different from one another and people's perception of what mega churches are about. We have a slew of historic black churches, as well as small independent congregations. Like, this is a very typical scene where you have an historic church on the Avenue, and right across the street 2 small independent churches. So True Word Apostolic Church and Hebron Tabernacle across the street from one another. There are a number of very historic churches that have 8 historic churches that continue to have worshiping congregations and have for 300 years, which is pretty amazing. And churches like St. Michael's and like Trinity Lutheran down the street, like the Germantown Meeting House, Market Square Presbyterian, all of these churches anchored their neighborhoods, but more importantly represented this amazing diversity of ecumenism at a time when to have the Lutherans and the Mennonites and the Brethren sharing urban space was really radical. This was William Penn's holy experiment. He wanted to have a holy experiment in Pennsylvania where all faiths would be welcome. And so back in Europe, the Anabaptists and the Lutherans were gouging each other's eyes out. But here they were sharing space and learning to be neighbors, and in fact the pillars of the development of this section of Philadelphia. Ironically, for this city, there are no Catholic churches and no synagogues on the avenue. There were at one time 3 Catholic congregations, and now those properties have been either torn down or sold to independent congregations. No Jews, and again, I only look at congregations that are right on the avenue. There are plenty of synagogues in the area right off the avenue. There are 2 really interesting mosques on the avenue. They're 30 blocks apart, and they're both Sunni, and they're very different from one another. So the Germantown Masjid is an African-American mosque, and it has been taken over what was an old retail establishment. It's very close to where Trinity Lutheran is. They have been very, very observant. So the women, for example, in that masjid are, many are fully covered, fully veiled. They can take up, men can have up to 4 wives. They don't believe in participating in the military or voting, for example, so they're very countercultural, and some would perceive them as isolationist. On the other hand, they have kind of a parish concept of a 9-block radius, and in that 9 blocks, they have invested in small businesses, they have built community, they have made streets safer and cleaner, so that in this 9-block area, and actually on Germantown Avenue within a 2-block section, there are 6 churches. And they have good relationships with them. Now, I was curious if you have an apostolic church right next to a mosque, right across the street from a Church of God in Christ, and down the street from a Baptist church, and they're all making exclusive faith claims. That is, our way is the one way to Allah or to God. How are they going to get along? And I found that they got along beautifully. And the reason that there was one dust up over parking a number of years ago, but they resolved that. The reason they get along, I think, is something that we really need to pay attention to. Virtually all of the Muslim members had been raised in Christian backgrounds, and they have a great respect for the black churches and their role in the struggle for freedom for the African American population. So there's a kind of respect. The Christians can be very conservative theologically, but have a respect for their Muslim neighbors because they see, first of all, that the neighborhood has improved economically and in terms of safety. They respect their countercultural stance and their critique of the dominant culture. And they all have a Muslim in the family somewhere. So they've learned at family reunions how to get along across religious differences. I think this social phenomenon is something that we really need to pay close attention to. Now, 30 blocks down the street is Al-Aqsa Mosque, also Sunni, and that is a mosque that is resides in what was a furniture warehouse, very nondescript, big brick building. And they are a mosque of immigrants. So they have 11 nationalities represented from all over the Middle East, and they have a school. One of the interesting things when I started doing research at Al-Aqsa was I went into the school and I introduced myself to the head of the school, Abdul Rahman, and I said, I'm Katie Day from the Lutheran Seminary. He said, oh, I know who you are. And I said, you do? How do you know who I am? And he said, from the website. And I said, well, if you don't mind my asking, what are you doing on the LTSP website? And he said, I'm a graduate. And he had graduated and been a Lutheran pastor and in the inner city in the 70s, and became disillusioned by what he felt was a disconnect between the gospel and the church hierarchy and the needs of people in the neighborhood. So he left the church and kind of wandered around and then discovered Sufism, and he joined a Sufi prayer group, and is still Sufi, and now is the headmaster of this school. But Al-Aqsa also has developed the habit of bridging differences. So internally, they've had to learn to have Palestinians and Ethiopians and Yemenis and Syrians and African Americans all learn to communicate and get along with each other. And they've taken that social habit of crossing boundaries and been able to build connections with the dominant culture. So they very much want to assimilate. So whereas their neighbors up the street don't vote, Al-Aqsa is a polling place. They have a CDC, a Community Development Corporation. They've also invested in the neighborhood. An interesting thing is that when 9/11 happened, they had already made some connections with the Christian communities. And the first calls they got to the mosque were from a rabbi and a Lutheran pastor who called them to say, are you okay? And they, like many Muslims in the country after 9/11, and even this week after the bombing in Boston, we're very anxious and feeling very vulnerable in our society. So this group from a mosque, from a synagogue and from a church, kind of gathered around this mosque and began to think about how they could support them. And one of the ideas that came out was, you're in a dumpy building, if you don't mind our saying so. Let us help you transform this into a worship space you can be proud of. Now this was kind of counterintuitive because they were trying not to be noticed, and in this nondescript building they weren't noticed. But together with some community groups and congregations, they began a process of getting volunteers and the mural arts program to transform this building into a beautiful, multicolored, gleaming mosque. And I hope you can show pictures of this. I have the pictures of the transformation in the project. Through that process of working together, having Jews and Christians working with their neighbors in the mosque, making tiles and painting and doing a beautiful mosaic, in that process, real conversation and connection started to happen. And as a result, Al-Aqsa is kind of the center now of interfaith dialogue here in Philadelphia. And it is the starting point of the annual Interfaith Peace Walk that takes place every year, will take place. This year will be the 10th year, and it always starts at Al-Aqsa. It is a walking dialogue, they call it, where people of all faiths walk from site to site, can be churches, synagogues, the Liberty Bell one year, and they stop and will have prayers and recommit themselves to having genuine relationships that cross religious boundaries. I found when I started the book that a lot of people don't take communities of faith seriously in the city. So developers don't take them seriously, policymakers, even sociologists who are studying the urban environment just kind of look over communities of faith. For example, they see them as not generating a lot of street traffic, not being real active agents in the local economy, not paying taxes, using up real estate. And so they are a benign presence at best and a kind of menace at worst. So we do have religious districts where we have, for example, in the Fair Hill section, which is the poorest neighborhood in the city, between Lehigh and Glenwood, there are 15 churches on the avenue, cheek by jowl, within 3 blocks on the avenue. So policymakers and private investors look at this and don't take communities of faith seriously. I found in our research which was both quantitative research and ethnographic, that as a matter of fact, these congregations were making enormous contributions to providing basic human services, providing educational opportunities, providing training and opportunities in the arts. And this would happen in large churches such as New Covenant Church or the Presbyterian Church of Chestnut Hill, which had lots of programs and served lots of people. But just as importantly, in these humble little congregations, like Jesus is the Way, right down here, which has a school with 10 children in it and a congregation with 30 or 40 people gathered on Sunday morning. They are, in informal ways, feeding people, doing on-the-street counseling. I asked a question in the survey, has the ministry of your church, to your knowledge, prevented a suicide? And virtually everybody said they had. And so these are things that are difficult to quantify, which I couldn't always quantify, and that's why I did the embedded ethnographic research. But found that these congregations in unsung ways were developing their neighborhoods economically and in terms of cultural capital as well. When I was called by the dean of the seminary, Faith Rohrbaugh, in 1984 to say my name had been suggested as a potential candidate for this church and society position at the Lutheran Seminary, I was living in Germantown, and working for the presbytery, and had to think for a moment. Seminary. I think I remember there's a seminary not too far away in Mount Airy. The seminary had such a low public profile. There was one little sign, little metal sign in front of the seminary behind the wall that said Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. And it exuded, the seminary kind of exuded this message that if you need to ask where we are, you don't belong here. So it had an extremely low public profile in the city and ecumenically, although it was very well known among Lutherans who were sending students here from all over the region. So when I came here, I was involved in a search process that lasted about a year, and during that time I was able to discern that yes, this is something I truly felt called to do. And of course, as a Presbyterian, someone from a Reformed background, this was a big risk for the Lutherans to entrust the area, the subject of church and society to a Presbyterian, because there are some subtle differences, although I think they're overdrawn. I think the Presbyterian Reformed understanding of the sovereignty of God and our place in the world to be agents of transformation is not that different from the two kingdoms, which can be overdrawn. But I've learned to appreciate that tension and that dialogue over the years. So when I came, there was a wall around the seminary. It was odd to me, as someone who pays attention to language, that Lutherans referred to the seminary simply as Mount Airy, because it seems so detached from the neighborhood of Mount Airy. As time went on, that started to change enormously. When John Van Oerstal came in 1986, one of the first things that he did was, he had his installation at the Franklin Institute because he wanted to communicate that we were in the city and of the city. And then he went around the neighborhood and introduced himself to all of the neighbors, which was radical, and invited them in. Over the years, I had, in about 1988, I think, I decided to have the Church and Society class meet here in St. Michael's. So we were meeting here, and St. Michael's was very excited about this, and they spiffed up a classroom for us, and we got a little money to contribute to them for rent. And the students were not happy about leaving the main campus, which is 7/10 of a mile away. And so I said, well, let's have a democratic process. Everybody make your case of why we should stay here or why we should move. And those who were opposed said we should move because the trolley tracks are messing up the chassis on my car and to drive down here. And besides that, there's a crack house across the street, and I don't feel safe. And the other part of the student body in the class said, no, we should stay because this is about contextual education. So I put it to a vote, and the students who wanted to leave prevailed. And we went back to the main campus, and President Van Oerstal said to me, you should have known better than to have a democratic classroom. You don't have to put that in. But that was sort of taking a temperature of how insecure people felt about journeying out. Then over the years, as the seminary has changed, And our program has grown. The Metro Urban Ministry concentration got started in the mid-90s, where people could actually kind of major in urban ministry, and we became very intentional about getting people in the city and making the walls of the classroom very porous and eventually very mobile, and bringing people in and going out and using Philadelphia as our classroom. So just last night, I was at a gathering of an organization called POWER, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Reform. And this was a large gathering of a broad-based community organization. There were 3,000 or 4,000 people gathered. They had a very clear political agenda of reforming education, about getting airport jobs reserved for Philadelphians, and immigration reform. And in this gathering, I was sitting with 18 students from the seminary, 18. I saw in the gathering many other of our graduates who were pastoring churches who had brought their congregations. The executive director, Bishop Dwayne Royster, is one of our graduates. And so, and Sean James took part in the leadership up front, and all kinds of our alums represented. So it was a proud moment. I really felt like we are really very much immersed in the life and the future of this city. And I've felt that when I've been to the Philadelphia Fight AIDS prayer breakfast, when we've had our own hunger prayer breakfasts, when I've been at demonstrations and vigils around gun violence prevention. The LTSP community is very engaged and represented, and we're providing public leadership in this city and elsewhere. And you know, that gives me a lot of pride in our institution and a lot of amazement that, you know, I've seen this change from over the last 28 years, and at times I've gotten impatient and it seemed slow, but really it's a radical distance we've traveled in 28 years. I look at the diversity of our faculty now with Anglican and Episcopalian, with United Methodist, Presbyterian, UCC. We have African American, Latino, and all of whom are making significant contributions. And it is, and perhaps one of the most radical transformations has been around the inclusion of gay and lesbian people. So in the 80s, there were 3 of us on faculty who were considered safe faculty to talk to if you were gay. And there were gay students there, for sure, and they were deeply in the closet and wanted to get through their theological education, wanted to know how to navigate through so that they could be ordained. I always advise them, you know, count the cost of the closet very, very seriously, you know, hiding who you are and your family perhaps from a congregation. So that was all very secretive. And then over time, we have seen change in society, change in the ELCA, change in our seminaries, so that now we have very naturally gay and lesbian people who are an active and out and healthy part of our student body and our faculty as well. So for that, I give praise to God and the work of the Spirit over, you know, these last 28 years. The diversity of tradition at LTSP has definitely made it a deeper, stronger, and more interesting place. I've certainly experienced the critical tension of theological debate in the classroom as people from different traditions have brought their own perspectives to bear, and there's not always agreement. This has not always been easy, but where else are those difficult conversations going to take place if we stay in our little theological tribes? I have come to very much appreciate the Lutheran tradition as being ecumenical at its core. And so to be Lutheran is to be ecumenical. And for a very tangible representation of that is that the ELCA has intercommunion relationships with a diversity of traditions and denominations that don't link with each other. So, for example, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians don't have intercommunion, but we both do with Lutherans. So Lutherans are kind of the center out of which there are all these spokes, I see, in gathering the people of God into one. So I think it has strengthened us and made us more interesting. It certainly makes for interesting classroom conversation. And the risk is, in these difficult conversations, that you will be changed, which is why we don't want to enter into them. I'd rather get my Lutheran or Presbyterian or Methodist language and perspective down pat so I can pass my exams and pass through my committees and not have to engage another perspective. I don't want to be changed, so I don't want to really engage those conversations. In a classroom, in a place as diverse as LTSP, you can't avoid that. And then it makes you critically think about your own faith commitments and perspectives and interrogate for yourself. And finally, you might change or you might come to reclaim your original faith tradition, in which case it will have more integrity and depth.